My name is Wes Monier. I'm with the Turlock Irrigation District, of course. Turlock was founded in 1887. Let me give you just a real quick background. We were the first irrigation district in California. We're one of only 4 irrigation districts that provide water and electricity. We are a public utility. This is kind of a map that shows our service area. If you'll notice, there is a difference between our irrigation service area and our electrical service area. Here's another map that shows our service area with respect to the Tuolumne River watershed. This is the Tuolumne. South of us is the Merced watershed that has Yosemite, and then the San Joaquin system. To put things in perspective, our watershed has an annual runoff of 2 million acre feet. The Merced is 1 million, and the San Joaquin is 2 million. We supply water to 150,000 acres. We're supplying about 5,000 farmers. We are the co-owner of the Don Pedro project. We own 68.46%. The Modesto Irrigation District, our sister district, owns the other 31.54%, and they're supplying water to about 75,000 customers. We supply power to about 100,000 accounts. So the presentation today is going to center on what I call the short term, that's the last 100 years, and the annual and multi-year events. Then I want to kind of touch on the long term, 1,000 years, to maybe answer our question, and then the near term to real time, dealing with the flood that we had this last year. So on the short term, the topic is hydro variability. This is a graph of the annual runoff of the Tuolumne from 1897 to present. And you'll notice that there's anything but a trend or consistency. If you take this data and you put it in a table, you see that it ranges from 4,800,000 to 351,000. So we use the term variability, but I don't like it. I would use the term variable with a stereo. I kind of like the Wall Street term, what is it? Volatility. That, to me, variability has some sort of control, and there's no control on what's going on here. If you rank that, what I tell people is that we have basically a 45-degree line. It's not 45, but it's as close as it can get. You see that the annual is 1,943,000. I do not like that number. I have to calculate it for various reasons, but there's certain numbers in hydrology that just don't mean anything. And for the most part, I think this number is misleading because you can see that I think the closest year that we had to an average year was 1988. For the most part, it's a feast or famine. Now, that curve, the question is that curve changing? So if you replot this data like I showed earlier, and then you take a running standard deviation and look at the first 50 years and then bring that forward, you see that standard deviation has moved from 765,000 to 1,129,000. That's staggering. So what does that mean? Because the average is consistent, the lows are getting lower longer and the highs are getting higher longer. And my question to everybody is, what does this do to the Fermi analysis? So all of these hydro projects were put in place in the 60s for the most part. The hydrology now doesn't support what was originally described for that project. And they kind of put things in perspective. Don Pedro, we built new Don Pedro. It's a 2,030,000 acre foot reservoir. We built that new Don Pedro to replace old Don Pedro, which was 290,000 acre feet. So what did the building of the 2,030,000 acre foot reservoir get us from 290,000? For the most part, 80,000 acre feet. when you take this and the other environmental requirements. So what about now multi-year events? This is just on an annual basis. So what happens when you look at 2-year, 3-year, 4-year events? So I'm going to leave out the 2, 3-year events to speed things up. But if you look here, a 4-year running sum, it ranges from 12.5 million in 1998 to 3,187,000 acre feet. And to put this in perspective, on an annual basis, we're supplying 550,000 acre foot to the TID farmers, 350,000 to the Modesto farmers. In a dry year, 150,000 acre feet for fish. And the city and county of San Francisco is taking another 250,000 acre feet. So you can see real quick here, on a 4-year basis, we're running out of water. Now, the difference between 2015 and 1990, 443,000 acre feet. That's almost 25% of the annual runoff. The difference between these two events, 12%. That's a staggering event. The two driest 4-year events within 25 years. So what does that mean? So I've asked experts and individuals in the field, well, what does that mean? And one individual that I'll name, Dr. Crawford, he's the gentleman that I cut my teeth on the hydrology. We brought a real-time model in 1997 based on HSPF. That stands for Hydrologic Simulation Program Fortran. That, he says, well, your time span is not indicative of what we're really experiencing. And I thought, well, I've heard of tree rings, so let's go look at some tree rings. Now, when I first thought about it, the thought process, there was kind of an aversion there because I live on a little almond ranch, and at one time I was growing 3,000 trees. And they never do anything you want them to do. I don't care how much fertilizer, water, from a production basis. And my neighbors are always coming in and saying, well, these trees are like Olympic athletes because you're wanting the most yield out of them. And so when you have a good year, they'll get tired, and the following year, they won't produce as much. And so I'm thinking, well, shoot, you might as well just add emotion in there and just stick a fork in it. However, when I looked at this, I was amazed that you could get this kind of graph. Now, I'm not a tree ring expert and don't claim to be. All this information is on the website, and I probably should have put that site on there. But if you just type in Tuolumne and tree ring, they've got all the data and all the stuff for you. So when I first looked at it, I thought, well, okay, I think I can do something with that. This is from that website. I've had to deal with worse, but it's there. When you graph it this way, the change with respect to the forecasted value from a tree ring versus the actual, you can see that we have some pretty big differences. I don't know that that's good. When this is the forecast from the tree ring. This is the forecasted runoff. And so the R squared is with respect to the forecasted runoff from the tree ring to the actual. Well, I was going to get into that, and I'm going to give you an extremely biased, unscientific opinion. And that's from my almond experience, and that is that the tree only grows so fast. However, on the low end, you can throttle it. Now, I'm looking for answers. I'm always looking for answers and clarification. So there's probably a better way to put that. So, but when you look at this, though, there does appear to indicate some trends. And as you drop off, the differences also drop off. And just to kind of talk about what you're talking about, In 1862, there was 102 inches of rainfall recorded in rainfall. This is considered the epic flood of California. California went broke that year. Thousands of head of cattle died, on and on and on. The San Joaquin Valley was nothing but a lake. By my calculations, and I stand to be corrected, we're looking at somewhere around 6 million acre feet came off that year. And again, the maximum, which is we had this year, is 4,800,000. Prior to that was 1983 at 4.6 million. So this is the whole history of the tree ring data, and then the blue is superimposed upon the tree ring data. If you look at this just with respect to the actual history versus the tree ring, and of course the history goes back to 1897, the graph looks somewhat good, especially on the lower end. I think it's something you could work with. However, when you look at a 2-year running summation, now all of things really start to lock into place. And I can't articulate it, but it gets back to your question. There's the variability of a biological organism. They're just not all going to do what you want them to do. But over time, they have to achieve certain goals. So the relationship tightens up considerably. 3-year, it even gets a little bit better, and 4-year. And if you'll notice on this particular issue here on the dry end, you notice things really lock into place here. There is this anomaly here, but the actual is lower than the tree ring, and I'll take it for a point here in just a second. This blue line represents the lowest value since the year 900 of the tree rings. So this part here, let me graph it here. That's these events here. And you'll notice that 5 of the 6 driest events, going back to 900, are in the last 32% of the history. The 2 driest are in the last 2.5%. And this value here, and the original reason I went to the tree ring data was to get some sort of resemblance. What does it mean when the 4-year event that ended in 2015 beat the previous event by 20%? What does that mean? Well, I'm right back where I started, because that event is still a record breaker, and it still beat any of the history shown by the tree ring. Now, your assumption there might be a question. Well, maybe the tree ring data did drop way below this value here, or the tree ring data is not indicative of what really happened. But those of you that are in the hydrology business, I got to be fair about this. So the measurements that we use to calculate the full natural flow and inflow into Don Pedro, they're based on USGS numbers. USGS doesn't recalibrate their gauges until they're greater than 5%, right? So there's an inherent 5% error in the best of conditions. And then I won't go into the other conditions that just exacerbate the problems that make it even worse. So come back to the experts out here in the audience. What does it mean when you beat the last 4 years, 2012 through 15, beat the previous record by 20%? I just think that has some ramifications. So just as a little bit more fun, I did some 25, 50, 100-year running averages. And there's some definite cycling going on. Around the year 1300, this area here, Tahoe. If you go up to Tahoe, there's trees in the river, in the lake, that's about 100 feet underwater. You say, well, how could that happen? Well, it's because of this drought. You'll notice that this is headed down. Now, with all of that, the reason that I kind of go into hydro variability, so Don Pedro is, on average, we get 400,000 megawatt hours. It ranges from 186,000 to about 900,000 at the max. Coming into 2015, we were actually looking at scenarios where it was realistic to assume that we would get no generation for 15 and 16. And the end result is that we went from some of the lowest generation and a forecast of 0 generation to the other extreme this year of where we had enough water, we had a unit out, and we would have broke some records. But Don Pedro would have been flat out from January 3rd for the last 8 months. Add on to that the variability of the temperatures. The rainfall, there's no even distribution about the rainfall. You can see that the months range from 0, for all intents and purposes, up to some very large amount. One month does not necessarily forecast the next. I love this graph. This is from Scripps. As I said, in the hydro end, we relish in the new records. And this graph is the best I've ever seen. So you can see that 2017, each of these different labels is a different year, and that year came on at that given point, and it's kind of like a horse race and takes over. And you can see for the most part, 2017 took them all out. So now, on a forecasting into this next part, this is where I would be valued to the conference here, but I don't know how you go in and articulate it without spending 3 or 4 days on it. So I'm going to kind of try to wing this a little. But coming into the 2017 year, things can change very fast on the hydro and on a real-time basis. So there's these magic numbers when you're doing the hydro end, and one of them real quick here is we had 12.5 inches of rain in the October through December on average. We actually had 2016, 16.56 inches. That's important and I'll mention it here in just a second. So on the 29th, we had been looking at 5 to 10 inches. They raised the forecast to 10 to 15 inches. Now, it's just part of the business. The forecast will go up and then down, they ebb and flow. But normally, we get about 5 to 6 inches in a month. So that's a staggering amount of rainfall. So we go from 5 to 10, 10 to 15, kind of slowed back down on the 30th, which you kind of expect so you don't get too rash initially. On the 31st, it's a good solid 15 inches over the entire watershed. On the 1st, we're at 20 inches of rain. Now, I put this graph in here over the years talking to the experts with the National Weather Service, and Gary told me he's got some meteorologists in here, so I'm looking for some pushback here. But this atmospheric river is the new buzzword. It used to be El Nino, but this is the new cocktail term. And in my discussions with the experts on the weather, I had been told, well, it doesn't work. You can't get multiple back-to-back atmospheric rivers. And what do you know? We got back-to-back atmospheric rivers here. And so that's the reason I threw that in there. And it is the state of affairs that we're seeing. It's also the technology. Again, this is just to beat the horse. This is, again, from Scripps. And the magnitude of the rain that we saw coming in through the March period. And I think this gets to that hydro variability. To keep going, on the 2nd, the forecast went to 23.2 inches. Now, if you remember in the forecast in Texas, they were talking about that they had 50 inches and the National Weather Service had to go back in and redo the graphs because the scales weren't big enough. Well, we saw this about five or 6 months ahead of time. So this is, and the reason that you're seeing this graph and not a graph from the National Weather Service is I couldn't get the detail because the numbers were too large. On the 3rd, 28.83, and on the 4th, 37 inches. This is for 16 days. Normally we get 36.05 inches in a year. It's a staggering amount, and I've been told by the National Weather Service at one time that really the most that you would ever expect is 18. It's just interesting, I feel. So how does this tie into Ascend? So there's a whole 2 or 3 day discussion here, but I'll spare you. But once we get out of the flood control releases, we're making large releases down the river. And what you want to do is, it's kind of like throwing a football. Once you get things controlled, you want to set the releases up so that you get out of flood control, you maintain a constant flow. Flow's going through the power plant, so you've got energy through the season, and then you slowly bring the river down so that you're not stranding fish. You're building the environment for the plants that are living along the riverbank and so on and so forth. You'll notice that we brought the river down and then brought it back up. That's exactly opposite of what I just told you we wanted to do. And why was that? So coming into this environment, not knowing what you can expect, so the idea is, and I'm trying to get a point across here to ask a question or to solve the problem. Well, and based on my experience with Ascend and the risk, let's introduce some uncertainty and then go along that path. So we'll operate based on the 1 to 10% exceedance. So we ought to always be over-releasing, and then we'll slowly bring things down as we run out of water. So for the next graph before this, what's going on in the next graph is that I plotted the National Weather Service each day. This is the National Weather Service forecast. It's their ensemble. From 1950 to 2008. This is all of the years, and this is only for 5 days. It goes out quite a bit farther, and this is the mean. So I do this for every day. And well, if we operate along this, if I assume that this curve is the extreme, we ought to be covered. This graph is all of those forecasts. And the point here, this is the actual full natural flow. And you'll notice that the Weather Service, and I'm not picking on the Weather Service, I have an idea why things are working the way they are, and there's just software limitations. But this is where the Ascend thought process, for me, comes in, and it's how you look at your uncertainty. The ensemble, the idea behind the ensemble is to get you the range, and this is 5 days. So we're outside of the realm on a sustained basis, day in and day out, and it just doesn't work. Or the end result is we have to bring the river back up. And you can see here that we're still on the outside of the forecast. So again, my point is that ensemble tool from the National Weather Service, it's not doing what I need. And I need this kind of graph, but I need it from another party. Does that make sense? So, anyway. Thank you.